Okay, this is a continuation of a summary of a lesson on how United States neoconservatives are manufacturing a new Cold War. Um, Given my expectation that most Americans will outright reject this, largely because they want to reject it, and largely because they have pre-existing notions that somehow that America is a peace-loving nation. I first set out to dispel that false, baseless myth by showing the actual facts, and that for well over 400 years, the United States has been almost continuously at war, right? With few of these wars being justifiable wars. Um, we're constantly fighting wars, mostly for expansion, whether territorial expansion or economic expansion, or both. So we're fighting constantly at war. Going back to Jamestown settlement, shortly thereafter we're fighting the Indians. All right, and then through our declaration of war, declaration of independence against Great Britain. You can say that the true Declaration of Independence was 1775, although the official declaration was 1776. But really, starting the war is the Declaration of Independence. That's when we're saying, well, we're independent. All right, and then we fought. As you can see, we fought constant wars with only few years here and there in which we weren't fighting a war. Out of our 244 years of existence as a nation, we've only had 16 years where we haven't fought wars. And normally we fight multiple wars at the same time, up to 8 wars at the same time. Here is examples some years where we fought 8 wars. Each for 4 years we fought 8 wars during the year. And that gives us a total of 675 war years fought, right, for an average of 2.77 wars fought every year, right? So, that dispels the notion that we're a peace-loving nation. We're always at war, mostly expansionist wars, and I went through some examples and a little bit more detail of expansionist wars and how we created our nation. Starting from just Jamestown right there in southern Virginia coast and expanding to the 13 counties, and then, I guess by the Civil War, we pretty much populated about half the nation. I think, let's see, this is Wisconsin. Minnesota was not included at the time, but Iowa was, right? Missouri was, and California, also Texas. All right. Yeah, and then to show the warlike nature of the United States, I taught a number of wars in detail, how the U.S. government manipulated the Congress, the public, and our allies into these wars. I taught all the ones in green. I didn't teach all these Indian wars yet, and I didn't teach the Revolutionary War yet. But I was planning on it, didn't get around to it. So yeah, and then I'm doing a quick review of these. I can't get into the detail I taught before. I just want to give a summary, just to give you an idea of how we start these wars. Just bare bones, minimum facts, all right, which unfortunately could tend to water down what actually happened, and also make it make my summary vulnerable to attack by people who want to opportunistically attack with some bogus manipulative attack. So I went through the Iraq Invasion War. I taught that, how the U.S. that was recent, how the Bush administration manipulated the Congress and just about all the nation, the public. They all went for it. Into that war, how the Johnson administration manipulated the country into the Vietnam War. I reviewed that. I reviewed one of many things we did in the Middle East to create conflict. I scrolled through a list to say, well, I taught you this at one point, but I can't teach it all again, so I'll just focus on one thing. We focused on how the CIA and the British MI6 manufactured a coup in which the Iranian democracy was overthrown, and we installed a dictator, the Shah of Iran. All right. Some tricky things were done there, including terrorist attacks, blaming it on the prime minister and his government, all sorts of stuff. And then I went through Pearl Harbor, how the Pearl Harbor attack was manufactured. All right, and the conclusion I stated at the beginning is the FDR administration not only knew the attack was coming, they in fact maneuvered Japan into attacking, and then once they knew the attack is underway on November 25th, they opened the door to attack in multiple ways. All right, and I said it up front, knowing that people are going to think that's crazy. And then I provided all the evidence to support it. And when you get to the end, there's no denying that conclusion if you retain that information. If not, well, you can just believe whatever you want, and that's typically what happens. Belief based on nothing. All right, so now today I want to cover World War I and the Spanish-American War. All right, we're kind of going back in reverse chronological order, starting from the most recent to earlier wars. All right, so World War I, also known as the War to End All Wars, which was nothing further from the truth. I mean, World War I didn't help at all. In fact, it made things far worse, especially with the Treaty of Versailles. And a big part of that, actually, you can say, was related to loans that we made to Britain and France, because Britain and France, well, I'll get to that later. So it had to do with war loans, a big part of it. All right, so World War I is often characterized. Here's an image of World War I. It was a static war. It was not a maneuver war. Oftentimes the lines barely moved more than 100 yards this way or that. And typically there were two lines of trenches, right? Allied side with French and British, and then the German side, or Central Power side, all right? And then in the middle there's what's called no man's land, filled with barbed wire, mines, and so forth, right? And very nasty war, very, very tough living conditions in these trenches. But worse than that, it was a very dirty war in the sense that chemical weapons were used, and all right, so brutal war. Now, there were three key things that fired up Americans to go to war against Germans in World War I. All right, get them all, fired up, and let's go kill some Germans. One was the U-boat sinking of the civilian passenger ship Lusitania. I'm gonna put that in there. All right, so a bunch of civilians were killed in this by the Germans. Another is effective propaganda campaign. Propaganda has always been used in war, but our first big propaganda war is often said to be the Spanish-American War. Well, the very similar methods were used in World War I to dehumanize and demonize the Germans, like it was done against Spain during the Spanish-American War. And the third thing, which is the key thing that got us into the war, was a German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare against U.S. shippings on February 1st of 1917, 3 years into the war. the war starting in July of 1914. So, based upon these, Americans will point the finger at Germany. The damn Germans, they're killing civilians, and, well, the propaganda campaign is on our part. But the German declaration of war, certainly, Germany initiated that by declaring unrestricted submarine warfare upon our shipping, right? But while Americans, based upon this, can point the finger and blame on Germany for the war or getting us involved in the war, question is, does the United States bear some responsibility? All right. Were we the ones who really instigated conflict with Germany? Let's see. So now here's a Lusitania incident. Reported in the papers. Here's the Boston Journal. Here's the New York Times. Hundreds of lives are lost on torpedo Lusitania. There's the ship. It's a big passenger liner, similar to the Titanic, built by the same company that built the Titanic, the Cunard Company. All right, New York Times says probably 1,000 dead, twice torpedoed. Well, that's interesting because it really wasn't torpedoed twice. The second explosion was what's called a secondary explosion. So the first torpedo caused damage, which set off another explosion. Either one of the boilers. Here's a 4 stacks, meaning there's at least 4 boilers. There's 4 boilers below each stack, and so it was either a boiler exploded caused by the torpedo, or the munitions that the Lusitania was carrying exploded. Alright, so another picture. Lusitania sunk by Germans, 1,400 folk aboard. Alright, actually, of the 1,400 folk aboard, 1,198, almost 1,200 people were killed, of which 128 were Americans killed. So that's our link to this incident. But just looking at all the civilians, no matter what nationality, the dirty Germans killing civilians. All right, so that gets into the perception of this. Now, I've shown you many cases before where there's differing perspectives based upon. Well, usually the key things that differentiate perspectives, cause different perspectives. The main one is different motives, different agendas, different ways of benefiting, different self-serving interests. That alters the way we see things. That dominates the way we see things. The second is different information. If you have limited information, it's going to affect the way you see things. All right? And the third thing, of course, is differing abilities to analyze things. That affects the way you see things. Anyway, so here's the U.S. public perspective. They read this in the paper. They see this stuff, and they see an unarmed civilian passenger ship being sunk by the Germans. So the murderous Germans killing innocent civilians. They're barbarous, villainous, vicious animals. This is just perfect choice fuel for propaganda. Women and children brutally slaughtered without provocation and without warning. Right? There's no cause for this. Without warning, the submarines. It was a submerged sneak attack, so that it wasn't up front. It was a sneaky surprise attack. The effects is Americans were shocked and angry, shifting sentiment against Germany. All right. So now this happened in May of 1915. Again, we said the war started in July of 1914, so this is less than a year into the war, and already the Germans are viciously murdering civilians. All right. Now, up until this point, the American population, the sentiment was evenly split in favor of, roughly evenly split between the Allies and the Germans, right? The Central Powers. The greater part of the population was white, and the greater part of the whites were of German descent. So yeah, you can see how easily, there was a lot of people who supported Germany at the start of the war. But this had a big impact in shifting American sentiment strongly against Germany and strongly in favor of the Allies, right? Which is a huge strategic impact. All right, so the Germans had a different perspective. A number of things, 7 things here. These are less important, so I didn't highlight them. We'll cover them, though. All right, the first thing was the U.S. was shipping mountains of weapons and ammunition and other war materials on British passenger ships, including the Lusitania. These war materials were being used to kill German boys. All right, so they're seeing it quite differently. They're saying, wait a minute. You're shipping all sorts of stuff which is killing our boys. You shouldn't be allowed to ship that on civilian passenger ships and get away with that. And as it was, at least 50% of all Allied munitions fired on the Western Front were made in the USA. So the Western Front is Britain and France. Eastern Front is Russia against Germany. So what that means is America manufactured the lion's share of munitions fired by the Allies. All right. So if the U.S. produced 50%, that means, Britain and France on average produced 25% each. So we doubled the production, even though we're not at war until later, of munitions. 2, the U.S. and British were using civilians as human shields to protect their war materials, and they shouldn't get away with that. 3, the Germans did their due diligence in trying to get the Wilson administration to issue a warning to U.S. citizens not to travel on the Lusitania. All right. So what happened? Okay, yeah. The Wilson administration refused. They rejected the German request to warn Americans, and so the Germans took out ads in newspapers. And here is here's an example. All right, a clipping from a newspaper. And side by side, there's an advertisement to ride the Lusitania, Europe to via Liverpool. Fastest and largest steamer. All right, ride the Lusitania. Here's the date you can go. I think this could actually be the advertisement for this the journey here. All right, and yeah, it must be, yeah. And so here's a German advertisement. All right, it's a notice that Germany's in a state of war with Britain, right? And the waters adjacent to the British Isles are considered a war zone. And it says here, travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of the Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. So it's trying to warn them not to ride the ship, right? The Germans tried to get the Wilson administration to warn Americans, but the Wilson administration refused. Clearly, the Germans were getting fed up with the practice of shipping weapons and ammunition aboard passenger ships, being protected by the fact that there's civilians aboard. So they're apparently, it's pretty obvious that they're intent on laying down making an example to stop this practice. All right. And Robert Lansing was the Secretary of State. He replaced William Jennings Bryan. I guess Bryan resigned. But anyways, Robert Lansing was the Secretary of State, and he wrote the diplomatic communications rejecting the German request to issue a warning. And I read his memoirs, and in his memoirs, in his language, he's clearly prideful and bragging how clever his maneuver was, and how he wrote the diplomatic communique response for public consumption. He says in his memoirs. One kind of side note. Recall that Lansing bragged about this, but also he was the uncle of the Dulles brothers. So this is part of the power elite here running this show in America. The Dulles brothers being the key guys during the 1950s, the key Cold Warriors, overthrowing governments and causing all sorts of trouble. and being lawyers. Well, I'm not going to get into the Dulles brothers. It'd be a diversion here. All right, so some minor things were the construction of the Lusitania was paid for by the British Royal Navy, and intended to serve as a warship during time of war, either as an auxiliary cruiser or as a troop transport. It wasn't serving in either capacity, however, it was transporting weapons and munitions. Lusitania was listed in Jane's warship as an auxiliary cruiser, another minor point, which is really not that significant. Lusitania was reported in the newspapers to have been armed with cannons, although it wasn't. It had the gun mounts installed, but the cannons were not yet installed. Alright, so these are three minor points. Now, a key major point, however, is a British naval policy, which prevented the Germans from doing an inspection of the cargo. Alright, let me try to explain this. An aspect of international law guiding warfare at that time, and for a long time before that, was formulated during the era of mercantilism, and in which the primacy of profits ruled, and it allowed for neutral nations to conduct trade with belligerent nations at war, and they could trade in all items, including items used directly for war, like weapons and munitions and explosives. However, there was a classification difference between contraband, which are those things used directly for war, like weapons and ammunition, explosives, and non-contraband, which could be used for war, but not exclusively, like food, medicine, uniforms, cloth and leather and everything else that's kind of used for war. But not exclusively. All right, and the rule was that before you could sink a ship of a neutral or a belligerent nation, you had to approach a ship, hail the ship, stop the ship, board the ship, inspect the cargo, and if it was carrying contraband, then you could sink the ship, but only after the crew is allowed to safely get off the ship, all right, into lifeboats, and then you can sink the ship, all right. If it's non-contraband, then you could not stop the ship. You gotta let it keep going. That was the rules at the time, all right. It seems crazy today in the era of total war, right, where you destroy everything, right. Fuel, food, whatever is all fair game. That's all part of the war-fighting capacity of a nation. But that's the way it was back then. Now, Britain's complaining, yeah, you're barbarians, you're attacking without warning, right? Well, the British policy made that impossible to stop and inspect. And here are things they did. One is the merchant ships they would arm. If you arm the merchant ships, well, you can't pull them over. They're gonna fire upon you. Another is they're ordered to evade inspection. You're supposed to voluntarily submit to inspections. Britain ordered their ships to evade. And then a third thing they ordered was ramming German U-boats, right, which were low in the water, without any armor in the hull, easy to sink through ramming. And then another thing that the British did is they developed Q ships, which were merchant ships, armed, but they had the guns hidden behind screens or something that's blocking. You can't see it. And when the German submarine would hail the merchant ship, which is actually a Q ship, right, and pull alongside, well, they would drop the screens and then just blow holes in the German submarine. So all of this violated international law and prevented the German U-boat captains from inspecting cargo prior to destruction, as per international law. So this forced the U-boat captains to sink without warning in submerged attacks. All right. So that's part of international law at the time. And while the British were demanding that the Germans follow international law and come alongside, they violated international law, prevented this from happening. But even bigger than that, a total naval blockade was against international law at that time, right? Which Britain had a blockade upon Germany. All right, so the idea is this, okay? Germany is trying to set an example, trying to stop this practice of shipping weapons on civilian passenger ships, protected by the civilians as human shields. But their plan backfired greatly. Not only did it not stop this practice, but it strongly moved U.S. public opinion against Germany. All right, so their effort failed there. It backfired, and it was a big propaganda and morale coup for the British, and it moved Americans against Germany. All right, and manipulating the population is a fundamental strategy. I told you that. I said that. I taught that in lesson 1. I said that. One of the fundamental, most strategic elements in warfare is proper handling of your resources, and there's 2 main resources, human and material, of which human almost always out-trumps material. All right, you got to get your people motivated for war. You got to build up morale. You got to get them fired up to fight. All right, wars aren't fought by weapons but by people. So the next key thing that got us into the war was German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare. I'm not going to cover the propaganda campaign. That's a whole separate lesson. But I'll talk briefly about why the Germans decided to declare unrestricted submarine warfare against American ships. So after 3 years of massive U.S. military support for Britain, I told you how we produced double the ammunition for the British and French than the British and French themselves produced. All right, almost half of the weapons and munitions fired on the Western Front were made in the USA. So after 3 years of this, the Germans finally decide to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare. Here's a picture of a ship going down. All right. Now, this was U.S. policy. U.S. held a one-sided weapons trade with Britain and France while claiming neutrality. Right? Saying, hey, we're neutral. You can't. And because we're neutral, we demanded that Germany cannot sink any U.S. ships. And we further demanded that Germans cannot sink any British ships so long as there's at least one American on board. All right, it sounds pretty unreasonable. All right, but that's what the Wilson administration demanded. All right, so for 3 years, Germany abode with that that demand by the Wilson administration and did not sink U.S. ships. All right, and the key reason why, Germany wasn't being nice to Americans. Oh, the Americans are nice people, right? Even though they're sending all these weapons and ammunition to our enemy, who's and killing our boys, right? They're nice. No, they didn't sink our ships because they didn't want to go to war with the United States, the greatest industrial power in the world. At that time, U.S. had for a long time become the greatest industrial power. In the 19th century, we surpassed everyone else. In the late 19th century. All right. So this next section outlines the arguments, the German arguments. For and against unrestricted submarine warfare. Alright. So the the reason why I'm going through this list is I want to make it clear to the reader here that the German decision to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare on U.S. ships was not a rash, hateful, vicious, I guess barbarous, act. It was very well, thought out. And all these reasons, I compiled a list from my research when I did this research way back in like 1992 or 93 or so, and read through many documents and books, and as and part of it was compiling a list of all the reasons for launching, the campaign against U.S. ships and against. So here are the reasons for, and then I'll follow with the reasons against. Now these were actually better reasons, better thought out, but you can see that these would also seem reasonable at the time. All right, so the first reason was U.S. neutrality was a lie. The U.S. is saying they're neutral. Come on, right? The U.S. was already at war with Germany, with U.S. war industry operating at full capacity, redlining, overheating, manufacturing weapons and ammunition for the British and French. All right, I told you, approximately half of the munitions fired on the Western Front were made in USA. Half of everything that both Britain and France fired were made in USA. All right. Therefore, because of this, war with the U.S. will make no material difference, because we're already pumping out ammunition at a greater rate as we can. Right? That was a German estimate. Since it was estimated that U.S. war production was already near full capacity. Right? They're gonna say, well, what's it gonna matter? Right? They're already pumping out weapons to our enemy, giving to them as fast as they can. It was believed that U.S. shipment of war materials was limited by shipping capacity. Right? They believed that was a limiting factor. You can produce all you want, but you're still going to have to ship it across seas and get it over there, right? And that was the weak link, the limiting factor. And it was believed that this could not increase appreciably in a short amount of time. It takes time to build these ships, right? These cargo ships. So this would not appreciably increase for a year after the U.S. entry into the war. It's going to take at least a year before the limiting factor here is going to increase. And it was expected to decrease with successful unrestricted submarine warfare. All right, so that was part of their assessment. And you can see this is all directed at U.S. war production, for Germany's enemies, Britain and France. With the U.S. entry into the war, U.S. provision of war materials to the British and French will actually diminish for, a while, as they divert these materials to outfit their own armies. So the idea is this. Up until World War II, the United States did not maintain continuous standing armies, standing military. We maintained military, but not in a large scale. Like the Europeans would have continuous large standing armies, because their borders are all coterminous, right next to each other, and they're all, there's constant threat. Well, the United States had a different situation. We were more an isolated country. We had two big oceans as big buffer zones to protect us. We didn't need to have this big defense at all times, a big standing army. And we didn't have significant military threats in our northern and southern border. No one's going to be attacking us from there. All right, so we didn't have to maintain standing armies, and what that meant was, once we go to war, we're going to have to make these armies from scratch. All right, and you got to recruit a lot of people. Then you got to get them outfitted. You got to get them trained. You got to provide weapons for them, and that's going to reduce the amount as we're providing materials for our troops. That's going to reduce the amount of war materials that we can send to the British and French with more immediate application in the war. Now, U.S. forces will not be effective for at least a year. It would take time for the U.S. to establish, outfit, train their Army units. That was their assessment. Although we got forces in quicker than that, much quicker than that. On the other hand, it was believed that an unrestricted submarine warfare campaign could bring victory within 6 months. This was overly optimistic. I highlighted in purple this because I think this was a key factor, the overriding factor here. The U.S., British, and French financial capacity to fund war production in the form of loans, credits, and bond issues was already stretched to the limit and therefore would not appreciably increase with the war. All right, so the idea is this. Let me try to explain this. This has to do with the difference between public financing and private financing. All right. Prior to U.S. entry into the war, the weapons production of our industries was financed mostly privately. I know there was one U.S. bond issue which made it a public government thing, which was really an act of war. But the lion's share of financing prior to our entry into the war was done privately through U.S. banks, and those U.S. banks received funds initially in cash payments and gold from the British and French, but that was soon depleted. Our coffers were stuffed with gold, and they ran out. So they financed the war primarily with bonds. They would float bonds, and those bonds would be purchased by the U.S. banks. Our banks became so loaded with British and French bonds that those bond values plummeted, right? And the more and more it's becoming like worthless paper. And if Britain and France were to lose the war, those bond values would plummet to like nothing, and that would have crashed our banking system, which would have crashed our economy. We would have been in a Great Depression. So yeah, it was becoming very strained. The whole thing was being financed by loans, by bonds. Bonds are IOUs. I'll pay you back later. I'll pay you back this much later. It was all being done in credit. Now, another kind of an interesting point here is America went from being a perennial debtor nation into a creditor nation, right? A big-time creditor nation with a lot of excess capital. And after the war, Britain and France owed us a load of money. They had to make good in those bonds, right? Now they decided they're not going to pay for this, all right? They're going to make Germany pay for it. So what they did is, in the Treaty of Versailles, they slapped on Germany these big war reparations payments, right? Getting Germany to pay for what they owed to the United States, all right? And of course, that reparations was one of the key things that really pissed off the Germans. It devastated their economy. It caused a lot of hardship. Was a big source of resentment, and was a key factor in rallying support for Hitler and the Nazi Party, making them nationalistic, and then all that leading to World War II and so forth. All right. So that's kind of a side thing there that this was strained, and they believed it would continue to be strained, which was not true. The German war effort on the Western Front had gone badly in 1916. All right, so the situation looks pretty desperate for them in 1916. They're looking for some salvation, all right, and they saw unrestricted submarine warfare was seen as a means of providing badly needed relief on the Western Front. I mean, they're getting just whacked by American-made munitions, right, and it would also provide a big morale boost, a psychological relief to the troops at the front. Now, while Germany was accused of conducting an illegal submarine war campaign, right? Not stopping ships and boarding for inspection, right? But sinking them with submerged attacks. But this was due to the British equally illegal evasion of search or prevention of search, plus the British maintained an equally illegal blockade, which was starving Germany. Now, finally, England was seen as the key to the Allied war effort, and maritime commerce was seen as England's Achilles heel. Right? They had to have this commerce. They had to have shipping support from the U.S. to stay in the fight. All right, so that was arguments for unleashing unrestricted submarine warfare. You can kind of see how people would easily fall for this, right? It seems pretty reasonable, but the better arguments were those who said that listen, unrestricted submarine warfare is not going to do it for us. It can make things worse. So the key thing that they said is, well, with if you unleash unrestricted submarine warfare, we're going to war with the U.S., right? And with entry of the U.S. into the war, the Allied war effort will receive a significant boost, both in material, manpower, and morale. Greatly increasing their ability to sustain their war effort. All right, they're going to get a big boost from this, right? No bigger industrial power than the United States, So I mean, that's why they're so hesitant to sink American ships. The same thing happened in World War II. Before U.S. entered, Hitler was desperate to avoid, any excuse for the Americans to go to war with him. Not because Hitler was a nice guy, he was like one of the most evil guys around, but he knew that it's just stupid to go to war with the greatest industrial power in the world. Conversely, German morale will take a devastating blow if the U.S. entered the war. Now, U.S. entry into the war would threaten to blow up the Central Power Coalition, right? It threatened dissension among the German allies. Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Germany were the four key allied group there. And any one of these nations may say, throw in the towel. Hell, this is more than we bargained for. This is more than we bought in for. We're not going to war with the United States, so we're going to sue for an independent peace. There was that threat. And contra-wise, there was a threat of increased opposition. For example, the Scandinavian states like Norway, Sweden, Finland, plus Switzerland, all indicated that they might declare war on the Central Powers if the U.S. entered the war. So if the U.S. threw in the towel, or not threw in the towel, threw in to go to war on the Allied side, that would encourage the Scandinavian states to join in. All right, who may have been maybe a little fearful of Germany's power. The U.S. military forces will have more immediate impact in a year. So, while the proponents for unrestricted warfare said that you don't have to worry about their military forces, they'll take time, it'll take at least a year before they can get people into the field. Well, the people who were not as optimistic about this said no, they can get them, and this turned out to be true. The U.S. was able to field forces in the field a lot faster than that. Quick victory. This whole thing. They assumed that the submarine campaign would bring victory within 6 months, and these people are saying, no, that's just rosy, too optimistic. It's just not realistic. It's overly optimistic. And here's the key thing: the people who against unrestricted submarine warfare said that U.S. financing of the war would greatly increase once the U.S. declared war, because now that would open wide open federal financing through war bond issues. All right, government-backed war bonds, not based upon teetering British and French bonds. Thus, financing of war production would no longer be limited to already strained value of British and French bond issues. All right. Now, one thing, as I mentioned before, that there was one government bond issued to finance war production before we went to war, which is an act of war, but it's kind of like a little known thing. While the U.S. forces may not be ready for at least a year, there will be an immediate spike in U.S. volunteers to British and French units. All right, so here's the summary. The two key detonators that moved Americans, that fired up Americans, that pumped up Americans to go to war, right? Well, there's a lot of patriotic stuff that's going on, right? There was a lot of propaganda, demonizing and dehumanizing the Germans, right? Making them out to be evil, and but the key actual things were sinking of the Lusitania, and then the German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare against U.S. ships in 1917. And in both cases, you have to say that we played a big role in manufacturing both of these. All right. Now we didn't sink the Lusitania. We didn't declare unrestricted warfare, but in shipping weapons on the Lusitania and not warning people, that to sail, not to sail on that ship when it's carrying weapons, ammunitions. And then when we conducted a one-sided military material aid to Britain and France, shipping literally mountains of weapons and munitions to them, which are being used to kill German boys, right? I mean, you cannot say that we didn't bear responsibility for those attacks. You cannot say that we were really neutral when we conducted one-sided trade. Shipping weapons on passenger ships, providing the lion's share, 50% of Allied war materials, right? So, did the U.S. bear responsibility for our entry into World War I? Absolutely. Right? Americans, the Germans declared unrestricted warfare. Let's go to war with them. Well, you got to look at what the government's doing. All right, so next is the Spanish-American War. And I'm going to pause briefly. All right. Yeah, I'm back. All right. So now, Spanish-American War. What I want to start with, I'll start with how we actually, the mechanics of how we got into the war. It goes down to here. All right. So on about April 11th, McKinley made a request for a congressional resolution to Congress authorizing him to use military force. And this is the wording of the resolution he submitted. It was passed in full except for one sentence. This was eliminated. The U.S. government recognizing the Republic of Cuba, which is recognizing their government, was eliminated. So we're not going to recognize the Cuban government once we go to war with Spain and but now, briefly, how this was a war resolution was the third thing here. It says that the President of the United States be and he hereby is directed and empowered to use the entire land and naval forces of the United States and to call into actual service of the United States the militia of several states to such an extent as may be necessary to carry out these things up here. These are the goals up here. All right. So now that is authorization of the president to use military force. And like I said, 3 times in our history, congressional resolutions authorizing the president to use military force have been sneaky, tricky, underhanded ways of getting a war. All right. The Iraq invasion war, the Vietnam War, and the Spanish-American War. And here's how it actually played out. All right, so this resolution in full with the sentence was passed by the House on the 13th and then passed by the 7th on the 17th. But then they went back and said, nah, we don't like this. Let's get rid of this sentence here. All right, we don't want to have to deal with a Cuban government that we may not like. All right, it's always they're always looking at a government that's going to, of course, be in our best interest. Both houses passed the resolution without this sentence on the 19th, and then McKinley signed it on the 20th. Then on the very next day, McKinley rushed to use this. He had his hot little ticket to war in hand. All right, he used it the next day. Empowered by this resolution, McKinley ordered a naval blockade of Cuba, and the day after that, the ships set sail, and they were already pre-positioned in advance in anticipation of a war. They were forward positioned in Key West, Florida, which is only 90 miles from Cuba. So they got underway, and within a few hours, they captured 2 Spanish merchant ships, which is an act of war. You're directly messing with a nation's commerce, and commerce is the lifeblood of a nation. That is historically and clearly an act of war. Then they set up a blockade of Cuba, another act of war, because that's screwing with commerce. All right, that's cutting off all Spanish ability to keep a hold on Cuba. All right. Then U.S. naval forces then captured a Spanish schooner and 2 fishing vessels. So in total, they captured 5 vessels. All right, all acts of war. But the key one was the blockade of Cuba. No, so these are all acts of war. And do you think Spain has to respond to that? Yeah, of course they do. All right, and for 3 reasons. You can't let another nation do that to you at one point of your interest. In this case, in Cuba. Otherwise, if you let another nation do that to you without responding, you invite nations around the world to do the same to you, do the same to you at every point of interest you have around the world, and then you're screwed. Then you can't handle the situation. And also another factor was there was a lot of political instability of the Spanish government, and there was a threat of a military coup. If the government was too soft and didn't respond to this, there was a threat that the military would overthrow the government. And likewise, there was a lot of there was a radical leftist movement, and possibly they could have seen this as a sign of weakness and launched a revolution. There's both international and domestic political considerations Spain had. They had to respond to this. So these are acts of war, and Spain had to respond. So they declared war on the 23rd. But only after we declared war and started war through multiple actions. So we're conducting war. This is warfare, right? Authorized by this resolution. Now, 2 days later, the Congress officially declared war, but we had already declared war with the resolution and made a number of absolute acts of war. And it's my opinion that I believe that Congress did this to manufacture the false appearance that Spain declared war first on the 23rd, and we only declared war in response to that. All right? Which is not true. I mean, the de facto, the real declaration of war was the war resolution, right? Which authorized the president to use military force, which is war. It's authorizing his capacity to wage war. So that's what started the war. Now, it's undeniable that the U.S. started the war. Question is why? Right, why did we start this war? Well, let's see. All right, so I guess to begin, we'll start with an introduction. Though some people, from my informal surveys asking people about Pearl Harbor, I'd say roughly half know nothing about Pearl Harbor. The other half knows something, and it's usually one or two things, like, oh, December 7th, sneak attacks, all right? Maybe they know Hawaii. All right, that's about all I know, though, right? So very few people know anything about Pearl Harbor, but even less know anything about the Spanish-American War. Just about all of them know nothing about the Spanish-American War. And if anyone perchance knows something, it's usually that Spain started the war by blowing up the USS Maine, or the explosion of the USS Maine was a cause for the start of the war. Right? Now, to this day, no one knows what caused the Maine to explode. All right, so here's the Maine exploding. Yeah, maybe this is a little bit dramatic, showing all these bodies blown up in the air. But yeah, it exploded from the forward part here, the forward gun magazine. And I'm guessing that looks like a turret that's being blown off here. There's the forward turret on the starboard side. The magazine was center line. There was a 6-inch gun magazine on the port side. Those blew. Anyways, it blew up the ship. No one knows to this day what was the real cause for this. However, we blame Spain, and then started the war against Spain. And then conducted a long-held plan to expand into Asia and the Caribbean for economic, political, and military purposes. Goals. All right. So this points to motive. The fact that we conducted this plan. It's like, wait a minute, Looks like this is what you're well moving. All right. So here are some reasons why the U.S. started the Spanish-American War. Now, it's undeniable that the U.S. started this war. All right. I just went through that. But why? Well, the obvious reason is that Spain blew up the USS Maine. Well, no. To this day, no one knows for sure how the USS Maine blew up. However, two modern engineering analyses show that the source of the explosion was internal and not external. All right. At the time, to get the war with Spain, they blamed Spain, and they created a hypothesis that Spain set a bomb under the Maine and it blew it up from outside. But no, the Maine blew up from within inside. All right, and there were two modern engineering analyses. One conducted by Admiral Rickover, who was in his own right a brilliant, literally a genius, naval engineering. But he got two preeminent naval engineering and weapons and structural damage experts to analyze the evidence and the data. There are photographs, and they both came up with there was also a National Geographic sponsored modern engineering analysis, and both of them concluded that the explosion was internal. I know in particular that the Rickover conclusion said that more than likely it was caused by a fire in the port coal bunker, which is adjacent right next to a 6-inch gun ammunition magazine, and that cooked off the ammunition there, caused an explosion, which then rippled through and set off the main weapons magazine. I believe they had 10-inch guns. I believe these were 10-inch guns in these turrets. And that caused a major explosion. So, I mean, this is a quick chain reaction. 6-inch rounds going off, setting up the 10-inch rounds, and the whole damn magazine, both magazines blown up. Alright, so blew up from within, not outside. Now, another reason was the U.S. economy was suffering its worst economic depression up until that point in all history. Second only to the Great Depression, which would come, I don't know, it's about 30 years later or so. And the salvation of the economy was widely believed to be increased export of manufactured goods. Right, that was a focus. Falling prices, especially of manufactured goods, was a problem, and it was, and because of that, because the focus was on export of manufactured goods, that meant that the key markets was not Europe. Europe was industrialized itself. They were largely an importer of American primary goods, foods and raw materials and cotton and so forth, right? However, it was the underdeveloped nations like Asia and Latin America who were the big importers of U.S. manufactured goods. So that was our focus. We needed to increase export of manufactured goods to Asia and Latin America to save our economy. And the overall plan was, this is a simplification of the plan. You build a railroad system to connect the U.S. interior into one integrated market to fuel growth, interior growth. And then you also develop transcontinental railroads and Pacific ports to connect U.S. goods coming from all the way from the East Coast and then from the Midwest to ports in the Pacific, specifically San Francisco, and then boarding it upon ships and then sending them to Asia to be sold there. And then in order to do this, you had to develop coaling stations along the way, and not just for refueling, but also for rest and repair. And then you had to have 4 naval bases to project power, right? To assert your safety of your commerce, your ships, and to enforce access to markets. And then you develop a trans-Isthmian canal, and that would also require protection from naval bases in the Caribbean. Okay, I'll explain this more as we go along here. All right, and by 1898, European nations were racing to carve Asia into exclusive spheres of interest, potentially locking the U.S. out of Asian markets. Okay, so this was a key threat. This was a key urgency. Why we had to go to war, right? If the salvation for the economy was seen, especially in the China market, and if you have European nations carving it up, right, saying that this is our exclusive zone, no one else can trade here. Well, that's gonna lock out the U.S. Right? So we gotta get our foot in the door, so to speak. Factors that kind of precipitated this. There for a long time there was European competition for colonies in Asia, right? And they're carving up Asia. But a key inciting factor at that point was Germany was a newcomer to the colonial race, having formed only in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. All right, so they're a newcomer and they're starting to grab stuff like all the other European nations. Another factor was Russia was building the Trans-Siberian Railroad, right, trying to aggressively expand into Asia, expand its commerce, connection, and control of Asian markets. It was aggressively expanding into Manchuria. It was expanding into the Liaodong Peninsula and also to the Korean Peninsula. Earlier in, what was it, 1867 or so, it took Vladivostok, the eastern part of that area. All right. And then a key inciting factor was the Sino-Japanese War. All right, this war was, of course, fought between China and Japan. And why it was significant was this: the people who dominated that area were the Europeans. Right, they were the ones who had advanced industrial and military power, all right, and organization, and they came in and they're just carving up everything. and that threatened Japan. Japan was under the threat of being carved up itself and made into a colony. And it was only Japan that successfully fended off European colonization. Okay, and it did so by having a radical transformation of its country in the form of the Meiji Restoration. I believe it was around 1867. All right, you know, Japan's being threatened, and so they figured the only way to fend off this Western threat with Western advanced industrial countries is to become just as Western as they. So in their Meiji Restoration, they radically changed their government, their society, their military, their economy, their education systems, and the first thing was to eliminate the samurai as a class, and to eliminate the shogun as a leader of Japan, the old feudalistic system. And what they did is they adopted kind of a British democratic monarchy, right? So they restored the emperor to power and developed a British parliamentary type system. Then they adopted Western industrial practices, Western stock market system, and they rapidly industrialized, especially in the production of textiles, for example. And then they adopted French and British naval practices, and including their ships. They purchased French warships, and then they purchased British warships later. They adopted Prussian ground force military, their army practices, structured after that. They also structured their education system after the German system. You know, what's it called? Realschule. I can't remember, but anyways, they followed the German education system. All right, so with that, Japan rapidly industrialized. Japan rapidly became a modern military power, and when the war started, all the European nations were, of course, very interested to see what happens, and they all expected China to dominate Japan simply due to the massive size difference of China over Japan. However, they were shocked when Japan won a quick, decisive victory over China. All right, and that set off alarm bells with them. After the war, Japan forced upon the Chinese the Treaty of Shimonoseki, in which Japan took over from China the Liaodong Peninsula. They also eliminated Chinese influence in Korea, so it's Korean independence. But that was to allow Japan to move in to expand its commercial enterprises in Korea, and they also acquired Formosa, the island of Formosa, but also some other smaller islands north of Formosa. All right, so they gained a bunch from China. Now, because the Europeans were threatened, three of the countries got together. There are Russia, France, and Germany, and they forced upon Japan what's called the Triple Intervention. All right, in 1895, they forced Japan to give up everything that it acquired in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. All right, and they took it. All right, and that kicked off a race between them to carve up China. So that accelerated the race. Another factor that accelerated the race was German invasion of the Shandong Peninsula. So the key German interest was this peninsula here. Here's the Liaodong, here's Korea, here's the Shandong. Germany's key focus was here. And so there was a race to carve up Asia. All right, Germany's focused here. Russia's focused in Manchuria and in Korea, and in Liaodong. They got this all from Japan, forcing Japan to give it up. French were in the south. Britain were you had India. You had the Yangtze River Valley Britain was dominated in, and then also Britain seized the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, way, right? So there's a rush. There's like gee, what can I liken it to? It's like a fear-fueled rush to carve up Asia, grab their piece, right? Germany was in the Shandong Peninsula, right? And so this was the situation. Now, the war would advance U.S. commercial interests in Cuba, which was being harmed by the ongoing revolution. There was a revolution in Cuba, which started in 1895, right? So for 3 years it was going on. And because of that revolution, the fighting, so forth, it harmed U.S. commercial interests. U.S. commercial interests was sugar, tobacco, and mining. Iron ore mining became really big. Cuba had very high quality iron ore. Though not a big picture interest, so Cuba itself, a lot of times focuses upon Cuba, right? And the Maine blowing up. Well, Cuba was really small potatoes compared to the big overall geopolitical commercial interest going on there. You got to look at the big picture. Cuba was not part of the big picture. It was an element, but it was not, the main focus. U.S. had interests, like I said, in sugar, tobacco, iron ore, and infrastructure development. Right? So, infrastructure development was very similar to, Western expansion. Right? You're developing the resource production out of the area. You're setting up a market for consumption of your manufactured goods, but also you create an opportunity to develop urban infrastructure. All right, and then with urban infrastructure, if you own that, you make bank on that every single day. It's just continuous profits. So, for example, key things that were of high need in Cuba were fresh water, clean water, pure water, and sanitation, sewage. Right? Well, that's infrastructure developed. Well, who pays for that? The Cubans pay for that every day. And then you set up electricity. Then you set up transportation, both railroads and streetcars. You own that, all right? And then whatever else, all right. Okay. That was a big money maker. Germany unified into a state. Okay, so that was a factor. Germany was unified into a state in 1871. It was disruptive. There was already a lot of colonial competition, economic, political, colonial competition. Now you throw into the mix another Germany, right? It was a rising power. It was also a latecomer to the colonial competition race. And by this time, much of the world was already carved up. There wasn't much left for Germany to take, right? I mean, Germany expanded into Eastern South Africa area, and also the western side, so along the eastern coast and the western coast in the south. I know Germany was expanding in the Balkans and trying to expand. Well, they're trying to develop a railroad, the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad into Iraq, and then Germany was aggressively expanding in the Shandong Peninsula, and then Pacific Islands. I know I think this is the tip of New Guinea. They had Eastern New Guinea. Then they had a bunch of islands off of Eastern New Guinea. I think it's Bismarck. I think they had the Carolina Islands. They had the Northern Marianas. Right? They would acquire. We took Guam with this war. All right, that's important. Control these islands because this is our path to the Pacific. We need these as waypoints to refuel. To get rest and repair for our ships. All right. So Germany's acquiring that. Now Germany became also, because they were a latecomer, because there wasn't much left, a main focus of Germany at the time was Latin America. And the reason why Latin America, what they felt was open to them, was because that for about 75 years, since 1823, Latin America was protected from European colonialization. I mean, there were a few colonies. There was British and French Guyana, right? British Guyana, French Guyana, and there was that Dutch thing right in between. what was that? Anyways, um, okay. But by and large, uh, after the revolutions, the 1810 revolutions against Spain, Monroe passed the Monroe Doctrine saying, hey, you guys don't come back in, right? No Europeans come back in. They gained their independence, right? And this wasn't so much to ensure independence for the newly independent countries, but really it was more about, this is going to be a U.S. A field of interest here. And so Europeans were not able to colonize any further into Latin America, and that provided opportunity for the Germans. And the Germans came in large numbers, but they didn't come in to colonize with official colonies. They came in to establish commercial dominance, to establish communities, to establish businesses and banks, and then start dominating through commercial. Right, so they were a threat to the U.S. there because we wanted to control and dominate Latin America. By 1871, there wasn't much left for Germany except Latin America. Germany became a key competitor in Latin America, also a competitor in Pacific Island acquisition and China, Shandong Peninsula. Right, so Germany was a factor. And the last one is national security. To the extent that economic power is translated into military power, well then all these commercial interests and promoting commercial interests was also an issue of, literal defensive security, right? You don't want European nations to become too powerful, right? Because they can, right? You want your access to markets, but it was both an issue of economics and military security. All right, so this is background. It's economic background. It explains this in greater detail, although even this is a very oversimplistic summary. All right, I'm not going to cover this yet or at all because I believe that this would be fertile material for a bogus lying attack. It's once you get into the economics, it gets complicated. People don't understand it really. People don't retain all the facts, and then focus can be shifted upon some bogus attack, which get people to believe. Well, one of the methods of attacking is to manufacture the appearance of a legitimate debate, right? People may not understand a thing or know a single fact, but if they sense or know that, especially if it's past, that it's debatable, then the impact of that, social psychologically, is for people to feel justified in mind of believing whatever they want to believe, totally baseless, but believing it's valid, that their point of view is just as valid as any because it's debatable, right? And that's a method of manipulation, and this would provide open, fertile fields for that, so I'm going to avoid this. Maybe I'll come back to it at the very end. But here's the thing. It will also shift focus off of the fact that, there is no denying that the U.S. started this war. All right, down here, all this stuff. U.S. started this war, cut and dried. All right, question is why. All right. Now, what I want to do is I want to briefly just touch upon the economic conditions at the time, and these are you can say the economic depression eras. The first depression in the late 19th century was 1873 to 79. All right, and then you had 82 to 85, and then you had the big one was 93 to 98. This was our worst depression up until that point. Right. All these you can see were railroad related. You have massive expansion of railroad production, then crash. Right. So either it was mutually contributing. The railroad crash contributed to the depression, but it's more complex than that because there's an integrated system of resource production, railroad expansion, and all the industries involved. But but I'm not going to cover that yet. So I just want to show you that there were depressions, and here is a depiction of the severity of depressions in terms of unemployment rate. You see that the worst depression in terms of unemployment was the Great Depression. The second worst in our history was the 1893 to 98 depression. And you can see here, this is the data on unemployment rates. You can see it's between 4, 3, up to 5, right? But it jumps to double digits, and it doesn't return to normal until 1900. And a big factor in recovery of the economy was the war itself, which helped. So the war in 1898 was a big factor in bringing us out of that economic slump. There was a big increase in production, transportation, with the war itself. So now with this very severe depression, many people believe that the solution to the devastating economic depression, with all of its social and political instability, and also solution to the long-standing problem of falling prices. I'm not going to get into that right now, the cause of that. In commercial expansion, lay in commercial expansion overseas. You got to expand into Asia and Latin America. Of course, Asia is being threatened, and Latin America, you can say, is being threatened with German aggressive expansion there. Now, the people who said this included, presidents, senators, congressmen, secretaries of state. McKinley saying this, right? Secretaries of commerce, industrial leaders, bankers, commercial journals, military strategists like Admiral Mahan, historical writers like Brooks Adams, and I'm going to show you just briefly. Wait. All right, here's my larger file on the Spanish-American War, and it's 121 pages. I'm not going to show you 121 pages, but all this stuff I taught. Okay, so here we get into all these people. So depression causes, right? What causes depression? Overproduction, falling prices, need to expand overseas, right? Western expansion economics tapped out, all right? So overproduction being a factor here. Need to expand overseas. So all these, every time you see purple, right? These are people, Secretary of State Seward, McKinley saying we got to expand overseas. Let's see here. Here's McKinley Moore, right? We have good money, we have ample revenues, we have unquestionable national credit, but we want new markets, right? And as trade follows the flag, it looks very much that we're going to have new markets, right? So aggressively going for new markets. So what were the key markets? They're going for Asia and Latin America. Now it's funny that the Republican administration focused more on Asia, and Cleveland administration focused more on Latin America, but they're actually interested in both, right? So all these are statements we got to expand over. President Harrison, Whitelaw Reid, Harrison's running mate, Mahan, Senator Fry, Senator Everts, our Secretary of State Everts, right? Blaine, Cleveland, Gresham, Carla, all these guys, on and on. You can see on and on, all these people saying we have to expand into Asia. All right, that's going to save us. It's going to save the economy. Pull us out of that Great Depression. So they're all in a chorus saying we have to expand into Asia. All right, that's going to solve the solution of the poverty of that Great Depression. The U.S. had a plan for this, most completely and coherently. So not only are we going to expand, we had a plan, right? A clear, coherent, organized plan. Most coherently stated by Admiral Mahan, but also stated by Secretary of State Seward, Henry Cabot Lodge, Whitelaw Reid. And these are ones that I found. I'm sure there's other people. Senator William Pierce Fry, Secretary of State Baird, and the National Association of Manufacturers. So all these people and groups were saying we have to expand, and now, and we have a strategy, the plan to expand, and this was the plan that these guys were promoting. Let's see here. So let me show a map to make it better sense. You increase commerce with Asia and Latin America. So here's the U.S., increase commerce with Asia, sell them more stuff, sell Latin America more stuff. All right, that was seen as a big solution for our economic woes. Establish foreign naval. To do this, you have to establish foreign naval base to promote our commerce, promote our access to markets, right? To protect our commerce, our shipping, right? And the Philippines were seen as a key island, all right, because all of Asia wraps around the Philippines in an arc, about a 600-mile arc. And then you have to, in addition to getting the Philippines, you have to acquire coaling stations along the way, because the limited technology at the time was coal-fired boilers, which was inefficient. So you had to keep refueling periodically along the way. Plus, you had ships which were less ocean-going than they are today. You had the need for breakdown and repair and rest. Acquire coaling stations, also for rest and repair. Expand the merchant fleet. Develop the transcontinental rail system to interconnect the U.S. Into integrated markets. So you want to develop railroads to interconnect the U.S. into one integrated market, to increase transactions, to grow our economy, and then also to develop transcontinental railroads to bring, so that you connect all the goods that are manufactured in the East Coast and the Midwest and all the products of the Great Plains, whatever, right, with California, with San Francisco, then shipped on to Asia, right? Japan and China being the expected big markets. And going back to Secretary Seward, he envisioned a 30-day transit time from the East Coast all the way to Asia. And for them, back at that time, that was like light speed, right? Trains were new then. Steamships were new. Okay. Prior to that, you had slow water, or animal-driven, horse-driven. Okay. And then to reduce costs, because land transportation was 3 times more costly than water transportation. Water is a lot cheaper, 3 times cheaper. So you build a canal here, right? You ship to Asia. If you build this canal, not only do you get access to Asia through water, you get water access from East Coast economy, manufacturing, to West Coast, and also you now have direct access to Western Latin America, right? Western part of Mexico, western part of South America, all right, to expand commerce there. Prior to this, you'd have to go all the way around. If you want to go totally by water, you have to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. Good Hope? No, Cape Horn. Well, no, Cape of Good Hope. What? I always get mixed up with South America. All right, you got to go around South America, way down south, all right, and much longer journey. But also during the Southern Hemisphere winters, there's very rough water down there. Okay. So if you establish the canal here, then you have to have naval bases in the Caribbean to protect it. Key base would be Cuba. Cuba would protect the East Coast access to the canal here, the western access route this way. It also is key in guarding the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico. For example, let's say Germany gained control of Cuba because Spain was weak. Germany moved in, right, established military and naval presence there. If we went to war with Germany, they could basically block access to the Gulf of Mexico, cutting off the commerce coming between the East Coast and the breadbasket here, cutting off access to of all this goods here to Asia, all the manufactured goods to Asia this way. So Cuba was key. And Puerto Rico would guard the southern access, the eastern access to the canal here, but also Cuba or Puerto Rico could serve as a jumping off point if you wanted to conduct military operations into Latin America for whatever reason. Um, okay, so establish naval bases in the Caribbean islands, especially Cuba, to protect East Coast shipping lanes, access to the canal, right? Access to Latin America, and to fend off expansion of German challenge into Latin America. So yeah, return profitability of Cuban investments. So that's a factor. You know, the revolution is devastating sugar, tobacco, iron ore production. Right. All right. So that was the plan. Now, let's see what happened here. All right. So the war was kicked off by a congressional resolution. All right. Like I said, on April 11th. Well, what happened is a key factor was you had the revolution going on since 1895. Right. It's now 1898, and then you had the USS Maine blow up in Havana Harbor on February 14th. I believe it was 14th of 1898. All right. And then you have on April 11th, President McKinley asking for a congressional resolution to use military force, to authorize him to use military force. Sneaky saying away he's getting a war. The war passed it on the 13th. The House passed it on the 13th, and then the Senate passed it on the 17th. All right, and this is what it said. I'll read the whole thing, and then we'll dissect it. All right, so here's the resolution. It says, whereas the abhorrent conditions which have existed for more than 3 years in the island of Cuba, so near to our borders, have shocked the moral sense of the people of the United States, have been a disgrace to Christian civilization, culminating as they have in the destruction of a United States battleship, that's the Maine, with 266 of its officers and crew, while on a friendly visit in the harbor of Havana, and cannot longer be endured, as have been set forth by the President of the United States in his message to Congress of April 11th, 1898, upon which the action of Congress was invited. Therefore resolved, first, that the people of the island of Cuba are of right ought to be free and independent, and that the government of the United States hereby recognizes the Republic of Cuba as the true and lawful government of the island, which then we said, no, we're not going to do that. Second, that it is the duty of the United States to demand, and the government of the United States does hereby demand, that the government of Spain at once relinquish its authority and government in the island of Cuba and withdraw its land and naval forces from Cuba and Cuban waters. All right, that's an ultimatum. Third, that the President of the United States be and hereby is directed and empowered to use the entire land and naval forces of the United States and to call into actual service of the United States the militias of several states to such extent as may be necessary to carry these revolutions into effect. Fourth, that the United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island except for the pacification thereof, and assert its determination, or when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. All right. So let's take a look at this. What they're doing up here is trying to play the moral card. You know, we're doing this for moral good reasons, right? Then they're pulling out the main card. Well, you know, they're not clearly stating that Spain blew it up, but they're really pinning it. They're essentially pinning it on Spain, right? That Spain is responsible for this, right? All right, so we'll start there. So the moral card here, you know, oh, the Spanish were doing such horrible things, and what happened was, there had been a number of Spanish, Cuban independence movements, you know, revolutions against Spain ongoing, and I think this was like the second or third in the series. right? And this one in particular was actually kicked off by U.S. Legislative Act, the Wilson-Gorman Tariff, which rescinded Cuba's special trade relations with the United States. Duty-free export of goods to the United States, and because of that, it lost that. It lost out, for example, in terms of sugar to Hawaii, and that killed the Cuban sugar industry, which became heavily dependent upon sugar because largely due to U.S. commercial development, which shifted the economy to be a more almost monolithic sugar-based economy. Once that was damaged, a lot of people lost their jobs. Plantations became unprofitable. People were laid off, lost their jobs, and then there was a lot of, unemployment and poverty and all that goes with it. So they started revolting. That became a key instigator of the revolt, and then to try to kind of try to suppress that revolt, one of the policies that Spain used was called reconcentration, were to better control the population, who could conduct guerrilla operations from the jungles, from the forest, whatever. Right? They tried to gather up all the people and put them into urban areas, secured, try to basically keep them almost like in a concentration camp there, and that led to pretty horrible conditions, insufficient, clean water, sanitation, so forth, and there was health problems, all right, which were bad, right? Now, it's shocking to the moral sense of the American people. I bet you most American people weren't even paying attention, right? Disgrace to Christian civilization. But all this stuff right here, this is what's funny about this, all right? So, I mean, this is nothing. This is no different from what we've done throughout our history. For example, with this war, right, we had to take these key islands, right, to get the key thing about expanding trade with Asia. One of which was the Philippines. In fact, that was a key island, all right? And as soon as we went to war, the first military action was not to attack Cuba, right? That came later, right? The first thing that happened was attack upon the Philippines, all right? That was Commodore Dewey's attack upon Manila Bay, all right? And then we invaded the Philippines, and when we invaded the Philippines, U.S. forces were first greeted as liberators, from the Spanish, domination. However, the Filipinos quickly realized that we weren't there to liberate them from Spain. We were there just to take over. So they fought a war with us beginning in 1899 and lasting to 1913. So 14-year war, a bloody, dirty war to put down insurrection by the Filipinos who wanted their independence, right? We're saying, no, we're taking over. And in this war, there was a lot of torture that was used, but also reconcentration. We used the same reconcentration camps, plus we used a lot of torture, right, that the Spain was using. So we're saying, we're doing this because we're such good-hearted Christians. Oh, come on. We did just as bad, if not worse, to the Filipinos right after this. And we have a long history doing this. Just think of all the Indian wars we fought, moving them off their land continuously until there's no place for them to go. So we shoved them onto reservations, right? What were the reservations? They were concentration camps, essentially, right? Getting out of there, put them onto worthless, barren land, right? And, for example, we did the same thing with Japanese Americans. Now, I have something with Vietnamese. I'm trying to think... Vietnamese, or what was this all about? I can't remember what this is all about. Vietnamese, concentration camps for Vietnamese here. I can't remember now. But we did this to the Japanese Americans during World War II, right? West Coast Japanese Americans were all rounded up and thrown into these camps. All right, so now, culminating as it have in the destruction of the United States battleship, they're trying to pin blame for the Maine on Spain, right? That became actually the key detonator. for the American public, this image of Spain doing this was what got riled up Americans to fight. Right? To this day, no one knows who did it. And modern engineering analysis say that it was an internal explosion, not external. All right. So this thing here, recognize that Cuba, they're free and independent. Okay, fine. But we're not going to recognize their government. So this was deleted from the final version, which was passed on the 19th, signed by McKinley on the 20th. All right. And now this is an ultimatum. It's saying you get the hell out of Cuba now. That's what it's saying. Right? Demand that the government of Spain at once relinquish its authority and government of the island of Cuba, withdraw its land and naval force. That's get out now. You're done. Right? Get out now. That's an ultimatum. And they don't do that, right? Well, the president's directed to use military force, which he did, right? So this here, it's amazing that congressmen to this day keep falling for congressional resolution authorizing use of military force, right? Which is a sneaky way of getting into war. All right, 3 times it's been done. All right, it is a de facto, real case declaration of war. Right, there's very little difference. I'm trying to think of the difference. There's minor points. There's a difference between a congressional resolution authorizing use of military force and a declaration of war. I mean, with the use authorizing, you can have unlimited defense military appropriation budgets. You can call up the draft. You can put troops in, on foreign land, all right, in a war, right, all with a congressional resolution. The only difference, I think, is as far as arrests of foreign nationals. I believe they have to be arrested and accused of spying, but with a declaration of war, you can arrest foreign nationals. I believe you can shut down foreign businesses in the United States. I don't know, things like that. But it's minor, right? It's essentially a declaration of war. All right. So now, once McKinley got the resolution, he immediately next day acted upon it. Ordered the naval blockade, which is an act of war, and then that was conducted on the 22nd, right, with 5 captured ships, which is an act of war, plus the key one being the blockade of Cuba, which is an act of war. Then only then did Spain respond and declare war. They had to declare war. They can't let that stand without responding to that. And then Congress declared war on Spain. Officially declared war. I'm thinking this is just window dressing, making it appear that Spain declared wars first. This is bogus because the real declaration of war was here. The real acts of war were here. Now, question is, what do we do? We conducted a plan. Remember the plan I told you about to expand commerce in both Asia and Latin America, right? And the reason being, you had the U.S. economy tanked here. The solution being seen by people across the board: expansion of export of manufactured goods to Asia and Latin America. What do we do? First thing is we took the Philippines. We attacked the Philippines, took the Philippines. All right. Then we took Cuba, all in the same year. Cuba, Puerto Rico. Remember I told you how those are both essential? We annexed Hawaii. We took Wake, Guam, Philippines. We settled American Samoa, acquired American Samoa, then issued the open door policy. So, explanation of how we conducted the plan, right? The commercial expansion plan to increase commerce with Asia and Latin America, especially export of manufactured goods, right? You had the open door note demanding we have access to the Asian market. That was the John Hay issued that. Then established 4 naval bases to protect commerce, right, to demand our access to markets. That's the Philippine Islands there. Why this was key is because, here's another thing, a way of looking at it, right? Up and comer was Germany, but also France and Britain were still aggressively trying to expand into islands here. If we're gonna have our way into, we have to stake out our claim before they're taken, right? With Spain weak, well, there's a chance that Germany, who was an up-and-comer, let's say, could take the Philippines, or Britain or France, right? Okay, so we took the Philippines, and then we fought a 14-year war to consolidate our control over the Philippines, right? This was brutal. This was bloody. Reconcentration camps, plus a lot of torture. Just look at any U.S. American history book, right? Look up the Spanish-American War and the section on the Philippines, right? My book, I took accelerated U.S. history, and we had a book written by Thomas Bailey called American Pageant, and I still remember the pictures of Filipinos being tortured. It was drawings, but it showed them being depicted them being tortured. Expand the merchant fleet, develop the transcontinental rail system to interconnect the U.S. into an integrated market, and then connect it to the West Coast port. Then you can ship things over here. But better yet, build the canal, right? And you need these islands to protect the canal, access to the canal, also to increase our influence in not just Caribbean islands, but also in Latin America. And for the canal, this was a U.S. Total U.S. supported operation. The Panamanian element was actually the key Panamanian element of this. What happened is this: Panama here was part of Colombia, right? We promoted a revolution. And the key agents in the revolution was actually the Panama Railroad, which was an American-owned company, right? And they took the key actions to successfully win the revolution, right? But it was also supported by a large contingent of U.S. warships, right? Now, there were a couple warships directly on the scene, but there were warships that were sortied from the West Coast, and more warships. I forget all the warships. It was about 6 or 7 warships in total were sortied for this to support this operations. And they had orders to land and to prevent. Well, I have to go back and read it, but this was a total U.S. supported revolution. And in response to our support, we acquired the Panama Canal Zone. All right. Yeah, so that was part of it. All these are linked together. All right, so build the Trans-Isthmus Canal to greatly decrease shipping costs. All right, I told you 3-to-1 price savings for ocean shipping, water shipping. We drove the Panama Revolution and provided military support. Established naval bases in the Caribbean islands, especially Cuba, to protect the East Coast shipping lanes. Remember I told you shipping lanes here to the canal, also shipping lanes here to the Gulf of Malta, back and forth. All right, all the goods, the breadbasket goods coming down here through the canal. Okay, access to the canal, access to Latin America, and fend off German expansion challenge in Latin America. Return profitability to Cuban investments. Right. I remember I said that's a minor point. It's not a big picture. Big picture, big geopolitics, big international economics thing is this, right? And so the investments are in sugar, tobacco, iron ore, infrastructure. Profitable investments. All right, so that is that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off this discussion on the economics to a separate lesson. I'm going to try to get some sleep now, I did this starting at 3 in the morning, so I'm pretty tired. Then when I wake up again, I'll try to do the economics. All right, so I'm going to stop here. So just briefly again, I'll just review quickly before I go. All right, so the key things that set off World War I, that got our involvement was, one factor was the Germans taking the Lusitania. That really shifted popular sentiment away from Germany, against Germany, and then declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare against U.S. shipping, right? But the U.S. was clearly had the underlying responsibility for both of those. All right. Okay, then the USS Maine. All right. Briefly, I'll just review that. We said the two reasons are the shocking treatment of the Spanish people on the Cubans. Oh, that's so horrible. I mean, it was horrible, right? But all right. Don't shed those fake tears when we're doing the same thing and worse, right? We're doing far worse to the Indians. We did 14 years of war against the Filipinos. All right, so 3 years of war here. How about 14 years of war against the Filipinos, right? And then the destruction of the Maine. Well, no one knows for sure how the Maine blew up. In fact, indications are now, modern engineering analysis, that it blew up from within. All right. And then last thing is, we provoked the war by a congressional resolution, a war resolution, and it took acts of war. And then we conducted a plan for our expansion into Asia. We conducted every bit of this plan, taking key islands, all right, issuing the open door, establishing key forward power projection naval base here, all right, and then getting the canal.